Well, thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be in Austin and to be here at LASCON. The goal of today's talk is to see what we might learn from the history of cybersecurity. We didn't call it cybersecurity back in the late 60s, early to mid 70s. We called it information security, cryptography, to help us better deal with potential future challenges. Now, a warning, while I obviously did a lot of work in cryptography, this is not my I don't pretend to be current now. My interests are more in international security, as I was explaining it. So while I keep up with it, I don't pretend to know everything that's going on. So, fact one. Back in the early 1970s, when I was starting to work in cryptography, almost all my colleagues, in fact, I think it might not be an exaggeration to say all of my colleagues thought I was crazy. And they had two really good reasons. NSA had a humongous budget. Now, thanks to Snowden, we know how much, but in those days we didn't. And they had, let's see, this was 1970. NSA had been around for about 25 years almost, and of course, preceding organizations. So they had, a 25-year head start on me, billions upon billions of dollars. How could I hope to discover something they didn't already know? And the second argument was, if you do anything good, it'll never see the light of day. They will classify it. Now, both arguments had validity, and the first one, for example, came to haunt me much later, around 1990, when GCHQ, the British equivalent to NSA, put out this press release, and there was a paper in Cryptologia for the real story of the invention of public key cryptography. Read this, and it's people within GCHQ claiming to have invented what's now often called Diffie-Hellman key exchange, although check out Simon Singh's book, the code book, for why I believe it should be called Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange, if you're going to put names on it. Ralph Merkle deserves equal credit with Diffie and myself, and often doesn't get it. I don't have time to go into all the details on the GCHQ thing. For right now, I'll just say, yes, it was a problem. How could we hope to discover something they didn't already know? Of course, my answer to that was it doesn't matter what they know and what's classified. It's well established who gets credit in the open literature. It's not the first to discover and keep secret. It's the first to discover and publish. The second argument, that if you do anything good, they'll classify it, came to haunt us a lot sooner. I was publishing my papers mostly with Diffie. Ralph Merkle published in the CACM separately from us, because we were working independently at first, and then I kidnapped Ralph and brought him to Stanford as my PhD student, because no one at Berkeley appreciated him. In fact, he was in a course, CS 244, on information security, and he had to submit a proposal for a term project. And he submitted two ideas, one of which I forget, and the other of which was to develop public key cryptography, basically. And he still has the page on which the instructor, the professor, wrote, the first idea looks better to me, but maybe that's because your explanation of the other is so muddled. Ralph also had problems when he submitted it to the CACM. One of the reviewers said, you can't do this. The editor wrote back, and Ralph again showed me the letter, saying, this does not seem to be in the mainstream of cryptographic research. Of course, a new seminal idea is not in the mainstream of cryptographic research. Consequently, Ralph's paper was delayed. It took about 2 or 3 years to get published, whereas our paper, New Directions in Cryptography by Witt and myself, appeared 6 months after we submitted the final form of it. And so it looks like Ralph's paper followed ours, but if CACM does not have submission dates, but you'd see that Ralph actually submitted his paper before us. They're slightly different, but still the basic ideas are there. Well, in terms of if you do anything good, they'll classify it, what happened? A man named J.A. Meyer, who lived in Maryland and was an IEEE member, actually I'm going to put this down, I think. Wrote a letter to the IEEE from his home address in Maryland, saying he's really concerned that the IEEE appears to be breaking the law by publishing papers, and he never said in cryptography, but he listed several journal issues, and I had a paper in every single one of them except for one, and I don't know what that other paper was that concerned him, or if it was just a way to disguise that what he's really saying is, hey, Hellman's causing a lot of trouble, Hellman's breaking the law. So the IEEE responded to Meyer. Oh, Witt was able to determine that Meyer worked at NSA, and so in fact we're a little concerned. If NSA, we knew NSA was very unhappy with us publishing our papers, that they believed this was a born classified area of research. And we knew that, especially in those days, NSA is much more open today. They would not necessarily come right out and accuse you. They would do something like have someone write a letter from the home address. At least that was our belief. So I took the letter. So the IEEE replied to Meyer and sent a copy to me. And the reply said, we're aware of this law, which, by the way, involved 2 years in jail for breaking it. But we've always been of the opinion that we can't act as the gatekeeper. We can't control this. It's up to the authors. It's up to the authors and their institutions to make sure that they are not violating this law. It's called the International Traffic in Arms Regulation, or ITAR. And any of you who've had to go get export licenses know, I think it's still called the same thing. So I took it to Stanford's legal counsel, the general counsel, a man named John Schwartz, he looked at it and he concluded, he said, it's my legal opinion that if the law is construed to cover your work, then it's unconstitutional, because there's freedom of speech, there's freedom of the press. But he said, that's only my legal opinion. The only real way to determine this is in a court of law. And he said that if I was prosecuted, the university would pay for my legal defense, and if I was convicted, they would appeal. And I'll never forget these words. He said, but I've got to warn you, if all appeals are exhausted, we obviously can't go to jail for you. But with the university's backing, I felt comfortable going forward, and there was some debate as to whether I should give the papers or the students. Steve Polig and Ralph Merkel were the co-authors on these two papers. Oh, there was a conference coming up in 3 months. This was the summer of 1977 that we get the J.A. Meyer letter. And in October 1977, there's an IEEE International Symposium on Information Theory at Cornell University in Ithaca. And I had two papers there, one with Steve Polig, now at Lincoln Labs, and the other with Ralph Merkel. And I was going to have the students give the papers, but John Schwartz, Stanford's general counsel, strongly recommended that the students not give the papers. He pointed out that a newly minted PhD would have great difficulty starting a career with a multi-year legal case hanging over his head, potentially. And there were some other reasons why he recommended I give the papers. I went to the students and said, I'm happy either way. I feel comfortable. I'm not worried about giving them. But the students said, no, they want to give the papers. But a little bit later, I get a call. Both of them come to see me. Their parents have been beating on them. And they said, to keep our parents happy, please give the papers. So when it came time at the conference, just like today, we were called up for the paper, both I and the student went up, and I then said, normally Steve or Ralph would be giving the paper, but under advice of Stanford's counsel, I will be giving it instead, but I want him to get full credit, so pretend that from every other point of view, other than legally, as if everything I'm saying is coming from him. And of course, the students got more attention and credit for their work this way than everybody knew what was going on. But fortunately, we were not arrested, although, as some of you may know, Phil Zimmerman, who put out PGP, did have to get legal representation. I don't think he was indicted, but came very close. So lesson number one, let's see, going back to my colleague saying, I'm crazy, not the being arrested potential, because that's something to be worried about. Don't be afraid to undertake something just because everyone thinks you're crazy. And if you want to see a whole hour on this, I have a talk I gave at Stanford. They have a program called Stanford Engineering Heroes, into which I was inducted a year ago, January, and I gave a talk which is online. If you Google Stanford Engineering Heroes and then look for my talk, they'll have a link to a YouTube presentation. Many other techniques, which is all on the wisdom of foolishness. And I'll give you just a brief outline of some of the other technological breakthroughs which appeared foolish at first. Anyone ever hear of Vint Cerf? Yes, one of the pioneers of the internet and Google's chief internet evangelist. I think he's got the coolest title of anybody in technology. And so I carried on an email correspondence with about 4 people who I knew, and actually I could have done it with a dozen, all of whom have been highly recognized for their work and all of whom were told they were crazy at first. And this is a direct quote from Vint's email to me. Packet switching was regarded as crazy even after the great example of the ARPANET, which preceded the internet, of course, and was the father, I mean, the single-celled internet in a sense before it evolved into a human being. Most conventional communications engineers thought it would not handle speech, let alone video. And of course, today we watch Hulu or Netflix over using IP. Of course, it got better and better over time. The naysayers believed that store and forward would have too high a latency to be useful. They were wrong. John Chaffee, a colleague of mine at Stanford who really pushed DSL, he's the true father of DSL, which provides broadband to most of the world. We have cable in the United States. We often have a choice, but in most of the world they don't have cable TV, and it's all DSL. He wrote back, in 1979, as a young kid fresh out of Stanford, I got laughed out of the room in my first DSL meeting at Bell Labs when I pushed for more speed. I said 1.5 megabits per second should be possible on the existing twisted pairs. End of quote. Today, DSL is more than 100 times faster than that, and it provides broadband to 70% of the world market. Federico Fagin, who along with Ted Hoff are the 2 key people behind the first microprocessor at Intel. Federico wrote to me, in 1970, when I was designing the world's first microprocessor, the CEO of American Microsystems, then the largest producer of random logic custom ICs, which is of course the technology that microprocessors reduced their market share tremendously, took a lot of it over. That CEO was quoted in electronic news as saying something like, whoever thinks that a CPU will replace random logic is out of his mind. Now he had to call it a CPU because they hadn't yet invented the word microprocessor. I remember cutting out that, Federico continues, I remember cutting out that article and posting it on my office door as an added incentive to prove such myopic observation wrong. Brad Parkinson, the chief architect of GPS, wrote that the Air Force thought GPS was foolish. They thought the user equipment would be prohibitive, but we could foresee the digital revolution underway. The first GPS units weighed about 150 pounds, used about 2 kilowatts of power, and cost about $250,000 per receiver. Today, a GPS receiver fits on a chip weighing a fraction of an ounce, uses milliwatts of power, and costs for the chip only about $2. None are so blind as they who refuse to see. So don't be afraid of doing something that people think is crazy. That's first lesson. Second lesson is I did my best work in cryptography when I knew almost none of the relevant mathematics. So don't be afraid to wait. Don't wait until you know everything you should know before working in an area. If you do that, you'll never know everything you should know. You'll never do anything. And so I look back, it's almost embarrassing what I didn't know about the underlying. I actually had to go buy Niven's book on number theory. I had never taken a course on number theory. I had a little number theory in some information theory courses, but I had to learn a lot of it. And beginner's mind might even help. I think you're not stuck in the same groove or rut, and often a groove and rut are the same thing, just viewed from 2 different perspectives that the experts in the area are mired in. So I expect that some of the people here will be able to do things in information security that I would never think of. Another example is that the idea of public key cryptography flew in the face of the conventional wisdom of, let's say, 1970, 1975. You may know that, in fact, even today, people often will come up with algorithms for doing great encryption. There's no way to break it. Just don't tell anybody how it works. You've heard those. Of course, that's impossible. How can you have a national standard and you don't tell somebody how it works, like AES? And even if you're in the military, you should never use a cryptographic system whose security resides on the secrecy of the piece of hardware involved, because it might be captured by the other side. And so August Kirchhoff, who many you may have heard of, enunciated some principles of cryptography in the late 19th century, one of which is all of the security of a cryptographic system should reside in the secrecy of the key. Even if everything is known about the general system, that should not reduce the security. And so when we proposed public key cryptography, it almost sounded like an oxymoron. How can you have secure cryptography if the key is public? Well, of course, what people were missing is that there was only part of the key was public, the other part of the key was secret. And this is very similar to what happened with light. Back in, 400 years ago, roughly, there was this big debate as to whether light was a particle or a wave. Does anybody remember who was one of the prominent particle camp supporters? Newton, Sir Isaac Newton. Right, and you could forgive him for it. In fact, more than forgive him, you can credit him today, because the fact that quantum mechanics works in light and there are these quanta involved allows things like these GPS and this phone that I have here. But in the late 19th century, about the same time as Kirchhoff enunciated his principles, Maxwell developed his 4 famous equations that showed that light was clearly governed as a wave. And so at 1900, saying that light might have particle-like characteristics was viewed as going back to the Dark Ages. So when Planck, the very famous physicist, finally explained black body radiation. This is when you heat up like a metal rod in a fire and it starts to glow red, and then if you get it really hot, like a tungsten filament, it glows white hot. There's a spectrum that goes with that black body radiation. And classical electromagnetic theory, basically using Maxwell's equations and things related to it, predicted what's called the ultraviolet catastrophe. It didn't fit the curve. And Planck eventually figured out how to make it work. One of the things he did was he said, let's pretend light is emitted in quanta. And then he thought, as he took the limit, as the particle size went to 0, he might get the right result. Well, he got the right result, but when the particle size stopped just short of 0. And so, in fact, that equation, E equals h nu, where h is Planck's constant, is what was later discovered by Einstein. But Planck was so enamored of the wave theory of light and having moved out of the Dark Ages that when he wrote up his explanation for black body radiation, he wouldn't say light was emitted in quanta. It was almost as if it was emitted in quanta, or only in this special case. And it took Einstein about 5 years later explaining the photoelectric effect to really take it seriously and develop the quantum theory of light and quantum mechanics. So lesson 2, again, is beginner's mind. Don't be afraid, don't wait until you need to know everything. Lesson number 3 from history is to talk to colleagues from disparate but related areas, especially those not already working in your area. A good example there is, as I was working in cryptography, and I think Whit had showed up at my doorstep by this time, I went to a new assistant professor at Stanford, John Gill, who had a PhD in mathematics from Berkeley. Now, he worked with Manuel Blum, who some of you may know. So he worked on probabilistic computation and some very esoteric things. And I went to John because he knew more math than I did. And I said, John, do you know any functions that are easy to compute but hard to invert? A one-way function, which is, I'd started to develop with Whit a cryptographic taxonomy. And the simplest cryptographic function we could think of was a one-way function. By the way, John is one of the first African-American graduates of Georgia Tech. Well, he said, how about factoring? I said, well, we'd already thought of that one. Unfortunately, we hadn't taken it far enough and developed RSA. In fact, we walked all around RSA. That's a whole nother story. But John said, well, then how about indices? And I said, what's an index? It's what we call a discrete logarithm today. And so the basis for Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange and really, to some extent, the basis for RSA, because while it involves exponentiation and modular arithmetic, and so while factoring is part of the potential weakness or one way of attacking RSA, another way is as a discrete logarithm or an index. And so out of that conversation with John Gill, who came from a totally different area, hold on a second, came really two of the most important advances in public key cryptography. So talk to people from different areas. The same thing happened with elliptic curves, by the way. So for a long time there, we thought that we needed to have, in RSA, we needed to have P and Q, the two prime numbers, have certain characteristics. Like P minus 1 should have at least one large factor. Well then, when someone who knew elliptic curves applied that to factoring, it turned out that wasn't the problem at all. And then we developed elliptic curve cryptography. So really go far afield. One last lesson that I'll talk about today has to do with my current work. Part of my current work is applying risk analysis to a potential failure of nuclear deterrence. Clearly a problem of significant importance, even though it's being overlooked by society. And I won't go into detail there, but I'll just give you a little background and then show you how the same thing applies. I was able to take what I'd learned in risk analysis of nuclear deterrence and apply it to what I think can be a very important problem in public key cryptography. Many people, when you talk about nuclear deterrence, say, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's been 69 years since World War II, and we haven't had a nuclear war. What are you worried about? It ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, you have to break that down. What's the expected lifetime of a child born today, roughly? 80 years, yeah, a little more than 80 years. So if something hasn't happened in 69 years, does that give you high confidence that it won't happen over the next 80? Clearly not, and especially as you start to look at the near misses. Well, in the same way, people look at advances in factoring, which also have carried over to discrete logs. And so when we first came up with alpha to the x1, x2, which Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange, at that point, the best algorithms that I knew of were took exponential time to break it. Well, soon afterward, we saw that that the same factoring algorithms that Richard Schroeppel had developed, which gave rise to the quadratic sieve of Pomerantz, is actually based, and Pomerantz credits Schroeppel. He's another unsung hero of cryptography. Schroeppel didn't like to publish, and so he circulated his papers privately, and I had seen them. I sent them to Ravesh, Shamir, and Edelman, actually just Ron Ravesh, who shared them with his colleagues. And Pomerantz also had a copy, and in his paper on quadratic sieve, Pomerantz credits Schroeppel with having the basic idea. Anyway, as we look at the history of let's just talk about factoring, although it applies to discrete logs too. Around 1970, Morrison and Brilhart developed the continued fraction algorithm for factoring, which roughly doubled the size of numbers we could factor. And around 1980, the quadratic sieve, or Schroeppel's sieve, doubled the key size again. And then around 1990, the number field sieve roughly doubled the key size we needed again. So if you look at it, 1970, 1980, 1990, 10 years apart roughly, we have advances that roughly doubled the key size. But in 2000, was there another major advance? No. In those 10 years, 1991 to 2000, no major advance. 2001 to 2010, no major advance. So some people have said, many people have said, it looks like the advances in factoring have petered out. You can see where they would say that. But I applied the same kind of analysis I did to, hey, nuclear deterrence has worked for 69 years, there's nothing to worry about. Well, a good way to think of it is in terms of every decade being a coin toss. If the coin shows heads for that decade, then we have to double the key size. If the coin shows tails, we didn't have to. So the 50 years of experience we have goes heads, 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 3 advances in a row, decade after decade, doubling key size, followed by how many tails? 2 tails. So if you were to toss a coin of unknown bias and got heads, 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 tails, tails, would you be willing to bet much money that it's not going to show a head ever again? Absolutely not. And so why are we assuming that there won't be advances in factoring? Now, in the same way, let's see, yeah, we're doing well. Now, I first made this argument for a small private conference in January 2013, so what's that, almost 2 years ago. That June of last year, a paper by Barbulescu, Gaudry, Jou, and Tomei made a major advance in factoring, in discrete logarithms of small characteristic, like fields with 2 to the n elements, okay? There's this thing called let's see. The Morrison-Brilhart algorithm was essentially e to the square root of log n. E to the square root of 2 log n. And then Schropel took it to e to the square root of log n. He got rid of the factor of 2. And then the number field sieve took it to e to the cubed root of log n. And you can see that this is getting smaller and smaller. And the first advance by this group went to e to the 4th root of log n. And then, but it's only for fields of small characteristic. And so it does not break RSA. It cannot be applied to RSA, for example. And it can't be applied to most Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchanges. Well, but you have to worry. Before, we've seen advances that sometimes worked on fields of small characteristic, like Coppersmith. Yeah, Coppersmith came up with an e to the cubed root of log n algorithm for fields of characteristic 2 in 1984, which was extended to arbitrary fields 6 years later in 1990 by the number field sieve. So you have to worry about this. And while no one has yet extended that paper to fields of large characteristic or factoring, the authors of that paper have extended it and went from e to the 4th root of log n to basically quasi-polynomial in log n. So we're seeing advances, some warning shots there, and maybe they will not be extended, but prudence would dictate being concerned about it. And especially when you think of all that's at stake. Now, for decades, I have worried about what I call the limited gene pool of public key cryptography. When Whit and I, and then later Ralph, Ralph actually independently, even a little bit earlier than us, but then the three of us together were talking about public key cryptography, we thought that within 10 years there would be a plethora of public key algorithms to consider. Whereas in reality today we have basically Diffie-Hellman-Merkle, and we've got digital signature algorithm, which is closely related, and we have RSA, all of which depend on either on factoring or discrete logarithms for their security. It's a very limited gene pool, and now there's elliptic curve cryptography, which looks like it's somewhat different, even though it's a form of discrete logarithm, but in a very different kind of group. But that limited gene pool worries me, and I've argued for decades that we ought to think about backup plans just in case. Because let's say that someone took that current paper and extended it to arbitrary fields and to factoring. We'd be dead. I mean, electronic banking, all the stuff that depends on public key cryptography. And so how long would it take to put new algorithms in place? Years. And so what I've argued we ought to consider doing, and I don't pretend to be current, I don't pretend to be an operational person, I'm a theoretician, and I may see things as easy to do that are actually very expensive. But how expensive would it be to put in place a key distribution center or multiple key distribution centers? This was the concept of how we were going to distribute keys before public key cryptography was invented. We'd have one or more KDCs, key distribution centers. So let's say we'll just keep it with one. Everybody has a single secret key that they share with you, the KDC. When you and I want to talk, we start the protocol by talking to the KDC and using our private keys that I don't know yours, you don't know mine, but he knows both of them. He creates a random number that we will use as the key for our conversation, encrypts it in your master key, sends it to you, encrypts it in my master key, sends it to me, and then we talk. And by the way, you can use secret sharing techniques, so we could have multiple KDCs. Like a simple version would be 2 KDCs. We talk with both of you. You generate independent random numbers. We XOR them together. And then as long as either KDC is secure, our conversation is secure. Well, then what you do is you XOR that with a Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange, or a key exchange using RSA. Now, if public key cryptography stays secure, you guys were kind of just added benefit. But if someone ever breaks the current public key systems and we suddenly need security, we now have security because we have the system's been running all along in parallel. And so if that's not too expensive to do, and you have to think about what the cost would be if there's one of these breaks and what the probability of such a break is. I mean, even a 1% chance of public key cryptography being broken massively over the next decade would cause billions of dollars, maybe maybe even hundreds of billions of dollars in damage. For signatures, you might say, well, what can you do for signatures? Ralph Merkle came up with a tree signature scheme that depends only on one-way functions. It has some other problems with it. It generates only a limited number of signatures, but the limited number can easily be 1 billion signatures. And so again, we might sign messages using both either the digital signature algorithm or RSA and a Merkle tree signature. You now have multiple signatures on the same document, and even if one system's broken, the other signature still allows validity to be determined. Well, in conclusion, the 18th century statesman Edmund Burke said, "Those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it." I hope that I've made a case for applying that same saying to cybersecurity. Thanks very much, and we'll take questions. Okay, my original caveat about not being totally current comes in here. So actually hold the microphone, you may have some comments. About 6 years ago, Certicom asked me to give a talk up in at the conference they had in Canada. And so I actually looked into elliptic curves, and I became very impressed, and actually bought stock in Certicom right after the talk, which didn't do so well for other reasons. But it seemed to me like elliptic curves were really going to be an important technology because of these advances. This doubling of key size did not apply to elliptic curves. NSA had paid $25 million for if I remember the amount, or the US government at NSA's insistence had paid $25 million for licenses to Certicom's elliptic curve technology. But then in the Snowden revelations, the one public standard that I was able to see that looked really tainted was the elliptic curve pseudorandom number generator. Is that right?
I meant something different actually. Like I read like some articles where people were saying that the way how NIST not willing to disclose algorithm for selecting domain parameters for this is what bothers me.
Oh, I think that's referring to the pseudorandom number generator. There are, I think, 3 pseudorandom number generator standards that NIST put out, and one of them uses elliptic curves. And what came out of the Snowden revelations that if someone wanted to build, and someone correct me if they know better, if someone wanted to build a trapdoor, so a trapdoor is secret information that the designer used to build in a weakness, that if you know the trapdoor information, you can then break it quickly. But without knowing the trapdoor information, if the designer, for example, forgot the trapdoor number that was used, he or she could not break it either. The elliptic curve pseudorandom number generator could easily have had a trapdoor built into it. That is, if you wanted to, it would have been really easy. We don't know that that meant that they build a trapdoor into it, but further suspicion was centered on this elliptic curve pseudorandom number generator because NSA, the accusation in the papers was that NSA had paid RSA data security $20 million to make it the default in their BSafe toolkit. And I don't think NSA went to RSA and colluded with them, that RSA knowingly did this. I mean, NSA wouldn't do it that way anyway. They wouldn't trust RSA. But why they then pushed this one that could have a trapdoor in it as the standard is really an important question that I don't think has been fully answered. Does anybody know more about that? I guess not.
What effect and probability do you see quantum computing having on public key cryptography?
Quantum computing. That's a little scary. So basically, quantum computing is a whole different kind of computing that works. It's different from the Turing model, and algorithms have been developed. If you could build a quantum computer, which is a big if, then RSA could be broken, Diffie-Hellman-Merkle could be broken, like that. I mean, it searches the exponential number of solutions all at once. Again, someone may have more information on this than I, but I've talked to some colleagues, not in the last couple of years, but up to a couple of years ago, I did talk to a colleague who knew a lot about this and was told it would be at least a decade before there was even the risk that we'd have to worry about quantum computers of appropriate size being built. And if that were to occur, and it would take at least 10 years before that might occur, we'd have at least a 10-year warning. That is, we'd see advances being made, but it would be far from an implementation. So it's something to be concerned about, just like but I think it's no more likely or no less likely than an advance that would double or triple or otherwise increase the key sizes needed to the point that it just might not be possible. By the way, to put that in perspective, back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when I was giving seminars on this continuing education seminars, after going through my argument that DES could be broken with a huge parallel machine, I would then put up a slide showing the required key size for public key cryptography. And assuming, I think it was a microsecond per operation, key sizes of 512 bits took a billion years or something like that. But then I said, but wait a minute. Just as I was attacking DES, the data encryption standard, as being insecure because you could build a large parallel machine and you wanted it to be secure at least 30, 40, 50 years into the future, over which time, let's say 50 years, you'd expect, if Moore's law keeps up, you expect computing to become 10 to the 10th times as cheaper, 10 billion times cheaper than it is today. Because Moore's law is a factor of 10 every 5 years. So in 50 years, you get 10 such advances, 10 to the 10th. So when I took that billion years and started applying that, I mean, 10 to the 10th all by itself cuts it down to a month. Parallelism, a millionfold parallelism, cuts it down to seconds. And so when I went through it, I concluded that if you want to apply the same stringent level of security, which I think should be applied to any system, if you apply it to public key cryptography, I needed key sizes, even in 1980, of at least 4,000 bits to have comfort 50 years into the future, have some hope of comfort. And today it's got to be even bigger than that. And those key sizes just get so huge that another major advance in factoring might make public key cryptography, as we now use it, other than elliptic curves, really unusable. And so I think quantum computing is just kind of fits in with that same thing I already talked about. Advice for software developers trying to learn proper
cryptography techniques.
Applied cryptography. Not a theoretician. It's a good. I mean, people. I don't even know about transport layers. I mean, so let me just. I mean, understanding how to come up with algorithms is really different from understanding how to implement this stuff. Okay, should we stop there, David? Well, thank you very much.